So, dear friends, good morning. Can you hear me okay? Can I see some thumbs up? Yes. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you. So, dear friends, today is the 7th of July in the year 2024. We are in various places, but I am in the Sitting Still hut in Upper Hamlet. This is Thai's hut where he would stay with us when he was staying in Upper Hamlet. And yeah, today we are gathered together to share a little bit about our relationship to spirituality. And I gave this talk a slightly provocative title. Usually we don't title talks in advance. Usually we see what happens and then give them a title afterwards. But for the purposes of communicating about this talk, I was asked to provide a title in advance. So I said, what is the point of monks and nuns? And maybe you feel that's already clear to you, or maybe it's, it is a real question. But I can share that, at least for me, it was certainly a real question. And I think it helps me to make sure that I keep it as a real question in my heart, to keep that reflection and contemplation alive. Sorry, there's somebody moving, so it's quite a little bit distracting. I can see some of you on the screen in front of me. Okay, that's better. So, really, when I ask myself the question, what's the point of monks and nuns? It's also a question about what is the nature of spirituality, and what is our relationship to it? And maybe I ask that specifically as somebody who grew up in England, in Britain. I grew up in the northeast of England, in Durham, and I think it does make sense to kind of investigate how spirituality manifests itself in our culture now, and yeah, what it means to us. So I'm not talking about religion exactly. I'm not talking about whether we grew up with a belief in a particular faith, and whether we attended church or something like that. That's not exactly what I mean. So I think spirituality transcends religion, and one can be religious without being particularly spiritual. And maybe one can be spiritual without necessarily being religious. But I can share a little bit how it was for me. And then the invitation is for each of us, if you would like, to contemplate a little bit and see how it was for you. So I just take my story because that's what I know. And the invitation is for you to go on a little bit of a journey of deep looking. This is applied meditation, to see, yeah, what these words mean to us, and if there's something beyond the words, if there's something deeper than just a word. And I ask it also because we live in a time, at least from my point of view, of a crisis of spirituality, I would call it. And I think there are many aspects of what we might call the polycrisis, and certainly the environmental crisis, which to me are also manifestations of a spiritual crisis. So if I ask that question, it's also to address this other question, which to me is very important, which is how do we live without destroying our environment, our planet, ourselves, each other? How do we live in a way that welcomes justice and compassion, inclusivity, and non-discrimination? And I don't think we can really do those things unless we have some kind of connection to spirituality, and not just spirituality as a theory or as a doctrine, but as a practice, as a living practice. And all of this, to me, as somebody who grew up in England, is in the context of our history. I know maybe not everybody here grew up in the UK, but at least I grew up in a country which hasn't had active monasteries in it, or at least has had very, very few for the last almost 500 years. And to me, that is something. It's a feature of our shared inheritance and our kind of collective consciousness. And I think it's worth also looking into to see if that has any effect on our so-called individual consciousness, right? Because our individual consciousness is made only of collective consciousness, and the collective consciousness is made of individual consciousnesses. So I just tell you a story and we'll see where we go. So I grew up in Durham, and I went to school, in a state primary school. And one of the things that would happen in the mornings we'd have assembly. And I was very young, so my memories of this is a little bit vague, but also in some respects quite clear. There was a priest who would come in and talk. And what I remember very clearly is that at some point he came into school for these assemblies with a sword. And he was waving his sword around during these assemblies and talks that he would give us. And it was pretty much, I think I must have been 5 or 6, something like that. And it was a very striking image, this person in a long, black robe, waving a sword around and more or less shouting at us and trying to put the fear of God into us. It was all fire and brimstone. And it was, if you don't believe this, and if you don't profess that, and if you don't do this and do that, then basically you will burn in hell for all eternity. And aged 6, that was a pretty strong image. And I was trying to make sense of this and saying, is this true? Like, how can I tell if this is true or not true? And so I would ask my parents, I would ask my grandparents, I would ask anybody I thought seemed vaguely sensible what they thought about it. And my parents being, they had a certain approach to educating their children, which was not to impose their views. So actually, without knowing it, they were very much aligned with the 14 mindfulness trainings. And so they didn't want to tell me. So I would ask them, do you believe in God? Because this seemed to me a very important thing to resolve. Seemed to me pretty fundamental. And I wanted to know what people around me thought. So I asked them. And they wouldn't tell me, because they thought it was a part of their values that I should decide for myself. So then I asked my grandparents, but they had been coached by my parents also not to say whether they believed or didn't believe. So I didn't get any answers. And so I'm very grateful to my parents for that, actually, because it really forced me to consider for myself, what's the evidence? What am I being presented here? And with hindsight, I know what I did, what I decided. I don't know exactly why. I think now I look back and I see that essentially I had a choice of worldviews that was presented to me. Because for whatever reason, I also became quite fascinated in science and the sort of scientific method quite early on, maybe age 7. I was a voracious reader, and I got hold of various books. Um, One of my teachers at school also encouraged me and sort of gave me a copy of Plato's Republic when I was aged 8, and so I devoured that and various other things, the Odyssey and the Iliad, and I was still, I was trying to figure out, there are all these worldviews, which one is true? Is there one God? Are there multiple gods? Are there no gods? What can we rely on? What can we take refuge in? And at that time, nobody told me about Buddhism. I didn't have access to that option. So my options were slightly limited. And when it was between uh, man waving a sword around, um, and sort of what seemed to me to be quite rational and sane in the sort of scientific method, I definitely sided with science. I read quite a lot of the Bible. I found lots of, to my very literal, 7-year-old brain, I found logical inconsistencies. I said, this contradicts that, and then I would ask questions about that and be told, don't ask questions. You just have to have faith. Asking questions is bad. I didn't like that much. So all of these things led me to conclude that this was a bunch of nonsense. And so I really, I took refuge in science as a way to determine what is the case. And then I became quite zealous about that. Uh, and as I grew up and became a teenager, I started bashing everybody else over the head with what I thought was rationality and science, and I thought I think I was probably 11 or 12. I started trying to dismantle other people's faith. When I encountered somebody with faith, and generally Christian faith, I thought it was very important to help them realize the error of their ways. So I would go around trying to, use logic and what I understood as reason to dismantle faith. And I was sometimes successful. I to this day, I'm quite regretful about that. I think I did quite a lot of damage. Um, and, by the time I was 13, 14, I got hold of Richard Dawkins, The Selfish Gene, and that gave me even more kind of weapons and armaments uh, to attack people's faith. And then not only did I not have faith that there was anything, um, anything that could be called God or spirituality, but at that point, with Richard Dawkins, it sort of then undermined my faith in even goodness, that there was anything that could be called goodness or genuine altruism, love, kindness. That from that point of view, we're just, kind of complicated cellular, but biomechanical entities with only one purpose, which is to reproduce themselves. And everything, every kind of behavior that seems to look like kindness or generosity or altruism is actually just a kind of trick played on us by evolution, to help our genes win the reproductive war. That's how this is portrayed, or how it was portrayed at that time in the sort of neo-Darwinistic theory of the 80s, 90s. And then when I was 18, just 2 days after my 18th birthday, my mother passed away suddenly. She'd had a brain hemorrhage on Christmas Eve, and she survived for a couple of weeks in the ICU, had another couple of hemorrhages, and then passed away. And I remember desperately trying to apply my, you know, scientific understanding of reality to this new situation. And I was standing by the side of her bed in the ICU. Her body was still warm. My father was there. And I remember telling him, because he wanted me to come and see, visit her, basically, to be with her body. And I didn't see the point of that, because I said, well, a person is just a semi-stable pattern of neuronal activity, and once that stops, then that person is gone. So what's the point? She's gone. She was there. Her brain activity stops. She's no longer there. She existed. Now she doesn't exist, and everything else is meaningless. And in fact, even that's meaningless too, because we're not even really that. We're also, we're just genes trying to reproduce themselves, and anything else is just trickery, an illusion. And I said something along those lines to my father, which he wasn't especially happy about. And what I didn't realize is that I was also hurting myself with these views, with a very strong kind of ideological position. I didn't think it was ideology. I thought it was truth. And in my certainty that it was the truth, I thought I needed to kind of impose it on everyone else, or wake everybody else up to this so-called truth. But in the months that followed, I basically became very depressed without really realizing it, because I had no training, no ability to even feel my feelings. I didn't really know how to do that. What I had was logic, and it left me pretty high and dry. And I would go into shops, and the cashiers would say, "Oh, you look so sad." And I would get very upset with that, because I'm not sad. I'm fine. What are you talking about? But I kept getting this feedback from the world that something was up. And by hook or by crook, I found my way to Plum Village about 18 months later. And I was very, very lucky to do so. And I thought I was going to Plum Village to sort of give spirituality one last chance. Maybe there's something. I was still trying to determine, like, what is the nature of reality? Is it just atoms and molecules and physical laws and deterministic processes running down until the heat death of the universe, or is there something more? And for me, the something more at that time would have been essentially magic. It would have to be either it's that and everything's cold and meaningless and pointless, or there's telepathy and angels and goodness knows what, and levitation. And I was looking for something. It had to be very dramatic. I needed evidence that there was something other than just a mechanism. And I thought, if anybody can sort this out, maybe it's this apparently enlightened Zen master in the southwest of France. So I found my way to Plum Village, thinking that that was what I was trying to solve. And then in the third week of the summer retreat, there was this rose festival in which it's basically a celebration of motherhood. And it's mothers and fathers, but really, yeah, it's something that Tai created after his own mother passed away. And he wrote this very beautiful text called A Rose for Your Pocket. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's very, very short, just a few pages. And it's kind of it's like a prose poem celebrating mothers, all our mothers. And there was a ceremony. If you've been to Plum Village in the summer retreat, you might have attended that ceremony. It's very, very beautiful. And part of the ceremony is the reading of this text. And at some point during the reading of that text, I just started howling. I was 19 years old. And something about Thay's poetry, the simplicity also of his language, the directness of it, just got through all my layers of, rational armor. And I suddenly got in touch with my grief, which had been sitting buried for 18 months. I'd been completely numb, totally unable to feel. I hadn't been able to cry. I was, like a block of ice. And Thay's words got through all of that. And suddenly I was with this enormous volcano of grief overflowing. And so my journey began, and I'm eternally grateful to some of the brothers who were there that summer and who helped me to find ways to feel, and not be overwhelmed, to feel the depth of that pain, but not drown in it. And slowly, 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 I began to heal. And over the next few years, I didn't really know what was happening to me, because everything that Thay had talked about was not what I had previously put in the box of, this is what, if there was a thing called spirituality, it would look like this, right? Which was kind of magic and altered states of consciousness and I don't know, psychedelic stuff, basically. I was looking for something very intense, and Thay kept talking about, coming back to your breath, bringing your mind back to your body, feeling your contact with the earth, taking care of your feelings, uh, taking care of your relationships, being in touch with your relationship with your mother and father, family, ancestors, land, you know, all of these things that I really, really, really didn't want to do, because there was so much pain associated with those things. But I sort of couldn't resist. Thay was quite forceful. And so I started this work of reconnecting my mind with my body, with my breath, my feelings, with my relationships, with my ancestors, with my culture, including Christianity, because that was my culture. And over years, really, my views started to shift and change. Eventually, to the point after maybe 7, 8 years, I realized that just going to retreat in Plum Village once or twice a year wasn't enough. It seemed to me that whatever Thay was teaching and this sort of way of life that he was transmitting was more important than anything else happening in my life. And I had to devote myself fully to that way of training, way of life. And almost like quite against my will, in a sense, I kind of came to this realization, oh my goodness, I have to become a monk, because I just need to do this all the time. It's not enough just to, go on retreat a couple of times a year. Even if those retreats were getting longer and longer, at a certain point, it was, 3 weeks retreat, and then 3 months retreat, and then 7 months. And it's like, still not enough. I need total, this needs to become the fabric of my whole life. um, it seemed to me to be urgent. And urgent not just for me, but for the whole of humanity in the sense. So this really relates to my growing awareness of the kind of polycrisis. At the time, we didn't call it that, but um, it was already clear to me 20 years ago that in the coming decades, we would encounter suffering on a scale that humanity possibly has never encountered before. So I think that's still coming down the line in the next few decades. We're going to see displacements of populations due to climate stress, proxy wars, wars for resources. All of these things are already happening, and they're going to increase as far as my assessment of the evidence goes, and I'm not alone in that. And so my constant question, along with dealing with my own pain, grief, and suffering and aspiration, was what is the appropriate response to this? When we know that our current civilization is destroying, the fabric of the biosphere, is going to eat itself, basically, when we know that our even just consumption of resources. I saw a statistic the other day. I won't be able to quote it accurately now, but it's something along the lines of in the last 10 years, we've consumed as much natural resources as in the last 60 years. It's something of that order of magnitude. So the rate of consumption of natural resources is increasing all the time. And that has some hard limits in it, which we are already encountering, and we're going to meet some more of those limits very soon. And of course, it's primarily the people who are least responsible for the consumption of those resources who are bearing the brunt of the effects of the extraction of those resources. And I think for anybody who's aware and awake to that suffering, human and more than human, it's almost intolerable to continue our current way of life. And the question of what do we do about this, at least for me, was a very urgent one. I really felt like I can't live in a way that I can't continue to participate in this. I have to find another way. And also I have to understand what is at the root of this. If we're going to change it, if we're going to find a new way of living without destroying our environment, we have to understand how this way of living has come to be and address the root causes of our addiction to overconsumption. And I think in one way or another, I've been thinking about that for a lot of my life. Even as a child and as a teenager, I was already asking some of those questions. But when I encountered Tai and his teachings, it seemed to me that for the first time I was beginning to have I could see a methodology that allowed me to make some progress towards really understanding why is it like this and what can we do about it. So at one level, it's quite simple, right? Probably everybody here is familiar with the Four Noble Truths, right? So we start with recognizing there is suffering. So here I'm talking not just about individual suffering, but the collective suffering of this moment in our history, human and more than human, and planetary suffering, suffering of the biosphere, suffering of many, many, many species. And then we're invited to ask what are the roots of this suffering, right? Second noble truth. So the first noble truth is kind of empirical. It's just, there is suffering. Well, yes, I can confirm. There is suffering, individual and collective. I feel it. I see it around me. There is suffering. This is very it's like fairly scientific assessment of the nature of things. This is the case. And then we, it's quite a sort of logical step to ask, how did this suffering come to be? Right? So it's the roots of the suffering. It's like, what are the, how is this, everything depends on food to survive, including suffering. Suffering is supported, maintained by causes and conditions. And so if we can understand what those causes and conditions are that give rise to this suffering, then we will also be able to understand how to put an end to the causes and conditions that give rise to suffering, end of suffering, which is otherwise known as happiness or well-being, right? Which is the third noble truth. And the fourth noble truth, which is this, the way. How do we stop feeding the suffering? So there's a path to suffering, the roots of suffering. Second noble truth can be understood as the ignoble path. Thai sometimes referred to it as that. It's the path to suffering. And then the fourth noble truth is the kind of the opposite of that, is the noble path, the eightfold noble path. It's the path to well-being. So it seemed to me quite urgent to figure this out. And I also had to be humble about my capacity to do so whilst pursuing a career, a relationship, maybe having a family. I could see that it was very hard for me to maintain enough focus and concentration on these very, very deep questions to sort of break through and to understand really what's going on and what to do about it. And so because it seemed to me more urgent than anything else, I felt like, okay, I have to give this my full attention. And like I said, I was a little bit of a reluctant monk. I still wasn't sure, am I even a Buddhist? That wasn't really clear to me. But what was clear to me was that I wanted this training, and I knew that I had to engage in this training full time. So I wrote to Thai and pretty much said that I wanted to become a monk, and sort of went on that path. And now, however many years later, 17 years later or something, I'm still work in progress. But I have now a sense that it is, okay, this is maybe more of a question than a sort of statement. Could it be that it is important that at least some of us in society make this a full-time occupation? And if we look at our history, maybe British history, but also European history, is it not the case that for most of the last few centuries, there have been people who have devoted themselves entirely to the spiritual life? Now, we could have a question about what we mean by the spiritual life, because of course we haven't had Buddhism in Europe very long, and if we're looking at the presence of monastic practice in Europe, that would have been Christian monastic practice. But at least for me, when I have encountered Christian monastics, and we used to have this exchange with a Benedictine monastery in the north of France called Solesmes, and they would sometimes come here, and we would sometimes go there, and it was always a very humbling experience because at the time I was ordained for 2, 3, 4 years, and the monks that came would have been ordained for 40 years, 45 years. It was very impressive to see what does 40 years or 45 years of monastic life produce in a human being. And what struck me was that as long as we didn't talk about questions of dogma or what we believed in, we were very safe. We were on very safe ground. As long as we talked about what we did and what we cultivated, what kinds of qualities we wanted to cultivate as human beings, it was almost exactly the same. Everything that they were doing in their practice was to cultivate compassion, kindness, tolerance, love, generosity, um, and I felt like it's so clear that we're brothers in this. Um, and I think it would have been the same with the sisters too, except that in their tradition, the sisters are cloistered, so we didn't get to talk to them. That's a slightly different question. Hasn't always been the case, isn't always the case in all Christian monastic traditions, but in that one, it's like that. So it seemed to me suddenly that there was something about monasticism which transcends religion and doctrine, which is interesting. And one could ask, is that true? To me, it seemed to be true. And in our tradition, in this tradition, we have the practice of touching the earth, right? Is everybody familiar with the practice of touching the earth? I see some nods. Yes, thumbs up. A few nods. Okay. I can't see all of you. I have one screen in front of me. So touching the earth is not a devotional practice. It's a practice of insight. It's a sort of practice um, to get in touch with the truth, in a sense. And one aspect of that truth is to transcend the limited notion of our self, of our individuality, our separation. And so I find this a very, very powerful practice. And so we would sometimes do the 3 earth touchings or the 5 earth touchings. If you've been to Plum Village, you might have encountered these practices. They're all in the Plum Village chanting book. If you're curious, there's probably recordings of them online and on the Plum Village app as well, if you want to try them out. But these are ways, very practical and direct ways to explore the nature of reality, right? That's still what we're up to. And one aspect of the nature of reality is it could be posed as a question: are we separate selves or not? So obviously the Buddha says, no, we're not. But he also says, don't take my word for it. Investigate for yourself. So this also seems to me a very important question, also in the light of the polycrisis and in the light of our tendency to consume and extract and destroy the biosphere. I think somehow, if we're asking about the second noble truth, what is the root of suffering, the belief in our separateness and the kinds of actions that that belief causes is part of the reason that we consume and destroy our environment in such a way. If we could really feel in a very direct way our interconnected nature, then that would, I believe, give rise to an attitude of reverence and respect. Right? If you stand in front of a forest and you know that that forest is also you, then you might have less of a tendency to see it as a mere resource, right? To be cut down, sold, used, extracted. So the very idea of seeing the environment as, the way we see things as being there for our use, the way we understand ourselves as humans. We have sometimes a kind of human superiority complex, and in some versions of what we learn as Christianity, we're told also, we are the animals, the birds, the bees, the world is there for our use. All all of these things depend on the idea that we are separate from the world. And so if we could transcend that idea, maybe, you know, our whole civilization would change. The point to me here is that this is a very easy step to make at the intellectual level. Right? It's very easy to see that we depend on many, many flows, right? We depend on being part of the hydrological cycle, right? If there were no clouds and no rain and no lakes and rivers and no water to drink, we would not continue. We would die very quickly, right? So we depend on all the green and growing things in the world, you know, and in their interaction with the sun, photosynthesis, taking in carbon dioxide, releasing oxygen for us to breathe, we can sort of intellectually very quickly grasp, okay, the forests are my lungs, right? It's not hard. But what I'm saying is that there is the understanding of that, of our interconnection with the world, which is fine, intellectual understanding of it, also important. But there's also the possibility of a direct living insight of interbeing, of our interbeing with each other and with the world. The intellectual understanding of it is not enough to change our way of life. This is also something that we can verify experimentally, because I think this understanding, the intellectual understanding of it, is quite widespread already. And yet we haven't really changed course. So we need something more, which is the living insight of interbeing. And so then the question arises, well, how does one cultivate the living insight of interbeing? And for me, the practice of touching the earth is one of these ways. So what do? We touch the earth, and we maybe first are invited to awaken our felt sense of our interconnection with our parents, our mother, our father, our mother in us, in every cell of our body, our father in every cell of our body, our grandparents, all these generations of ancestors, human and beyond human. And something about that position, putting our heads down on the earth, you may find that this allows that insight to become something felt, not just something intellectually understood. This is my experience. It's something about that, putting the body in that position on the ground is different. That's something you can't really explain it, you can only experience it. Really highly recommend this practice. A very, very effective way to awaken that insight. And of course, it has to be a practice. It's not something that we do just once. So Tai and Sister Chan Kong would say, you know, do it every day, every evening before you go to bed, or every morning, or as part of your sitting meditation practice. A lot of us in the monastery, every morning after sitting meditation, we practice touching the earth to keep these insights alive. So first one is blood ancestors, and the second one might be spiritual ancestors. Right? So now we come to the question, for me, I had to ask myself, who are my spiritual ancestors? I know I've kind of launched many threads here. I'm going to try and bring some of them together. As I was doing this practice of touching the earth, I had to ask myself, what is my relationship to spirituality? You know, in Plum Village, we have days to remember our ancestral teachers in the root temple in Hue and before that. And sometimes I would feel a little bit blank. I'd be like, well, I don't really know them. I don't know much about them. You know, Tai would sometimes tell us a bit more about who they were, and I would sort of try to connect with that, but I found it a little bit difficult. And then in my own exploration of this practice, I found myself getting back in touch with some childhood memories. So as I said, I was born in Durham, and my family, I was really into bird watching. So my family would sometimes take me and my brother up to Lindisfarne, to Holy Island, um, because there's these puffin colonies, and you take these boats out to these islands, and it's very beautiful. There's all these wonderful seabirds, and we would quite often go to Holy Island, to Lindisfarne. And although nobody in my family was a practicing Christian, and we had no religious practice of any kind, when I started doing touching the earth practice and looking back through my life, I noticed something very interesting, which is that as a child, whenever we went there, especially Lindisfarne, I would almost every time, I think, I would get separated from my family, and I would stay in there's a place where the monastic herb garden is sort of still exists. I mean, most of the monastery there is ruins. But there's one particular place where the 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 monks used to keep a kind of herb garden, and I remember just getting stuck there several times, and I would just sort of sit there and look out at the sea. It was cold and breezy and cloudy, fresh, and I would not want to leave. And at the time, it was probably just mostly a source of annoyance for my parents. What's he doing, dawdling? You know, where has he gone? Go and find him. We have to go, because there's a causeway and you have to leave before the tide comes up. But as with this practice of touching the earth, I would look back and say, well, why? What was it about that place that for me was so magnetic that I didn't want to leave? And there were other places too, like Durham Cathedral. So I didn't like the sermons. I didn't like mostly the priests. I found a lot of it quite off-putting. But the fact that there was a space in the center of the city that was dedicated to silence, where nobody was trying to sell you anything, um, nobody would bother you. You could just sit there in this glorious space, and there was sometimes wonderful music. Something about that, as I look at it now, was nourishing in me the seed of spirituality and maybe keeping it alive. So I say this also as an invitation to everyone here to investigate what is our relationship with spirituality? What has kept that seed alive in us? What places? Um, what music? What architecture? What relationships? What practices and traditions? And what is it? What do we mean by spirituality? So as I said before, I ordained because I was trying to figure out what is the appropriate response to our destructive way of living on this planet, and how do I deal with my suffering, and how can I be of service to reduce suffering in the world. I didn't ordain because I was Buddhist. I was still very confused about that, and I even asked Tai, can I be a monk without being Buddhist? He just smiled. And so I became a monk, and on the day of my ordination, I got a name. And are we still connected? I see the screen's frozen. Still okay? Okay. And so the name I got, I heard it first in Vietnamese, Brother Phap Linh, and obviously I didn't know what that meant. And then Tai translated it, and he said, Brother, true Dharmic spirituality. And I felt it like a physical wave penetrating my whole being. It's like it entered me. And in that moment, I realized that I had this deep, deep wound. was only in the moment that the wound began to heal that I realized that I had the wound. And the wound was my, this kind of corrosive doubt. I called it rationality, but it was maybe a corrosive secularism, even a corrosive skepticism. Which I didn't realize that with this quite blunt instrument of skepticism, I had occluded my ability to see the nature of reality. I had reduced things to things that were expressible within the confines of scientific materialism. So atoms and physical forces and so on. And it simultaneously forced anything that I had that I could think might be spiritual into the same kind of box. So, and it sounds complicated, but I was whilst looking for evidence of what I might call spirituality, I had forced spirituality to conform to my expectations of evidence. Is that clear? So I needed spirituality to be as concrete as I thought physicalism was, or scientific materialism, atoms, matter, that kind of stuff. So I wanted to see it, touch it, hear it, smell it, taste it. Well, I wanted it to be as clear and graspable as I thought reality was. And so, of course, I by definition, I had sort of excluded the possibility of being in touch with the spiritual dimension. Anyway, I got this name. I realized there was a wound, but I was still very confused. Okay. I mean, I remember in that moment receiving this name, and I think the reason it was so powerful for me was because I trusted Tai so much. The fact that he'd given me this name meant several things. It meant, first of all, that spirituality is something real, because he wouldn't give me that name if it didn't point to something that is real, that can be experienced, that can be lived. So that was built resting on my trust built over several years of being around Tai in this man and his way of living. I was like, well, if he says it, I believe that there's something there. I don't know what it is yet, but I believe there's something there. So A, it's real. B, if he's given me that name, that means that somehow I have the potential to live into that name. I might not be able to do it yet, but if he's given me that name, although I don't trust myself enough, if he trusts me to have this name, then I can work my way towards it. And so that was immensely healing somehow, instantly. And yet at the same time, gave me this big question, all right, fine, you've given me this name, but what does it mean? But Tai was very generous. And over the next few months, he gave a series of talks. And there's one talk in particular in the New Hamlet where he made it very, very, very easy for me. Kind of laid it all out. And he said, he talked about the possibility of spirituality without religion, which made me feel safe. I was like, all right, I think I can do that. If I don't have to, sign up to anything or believe in anything, then maybe this is okay. And then he asked the question, well, what is spiritual? What is the difference between something being spiritual and something not being spiritual? Okay, that's a good question. And he made the question quite real by, rather than it being theoretical, he said, well, And if we bring it back to the present moment, what we have is actions of body, speech, and mind. And if there is such a thing as spirituality, then those actions, right, of body, speech, and mind could either be spiritual or not spiritual. And so that sort of simplifies things quite a lot. Rather than being this abstract thing out there, suddenly it's about what we do. And then it's not so much what we do, but how we do it. So that's how we move with our body, how we speak, and how we think. So we can all ask ourselves right now, is there a way of being in the world, of acting with our body that is that can either be spiritual or not spiritual? So we can make it even more simple. Take an example, and this is what Tay did. He said, well, when you drink a cup of water, sometimes it's mundane, worldly, meaningless, but sometimes it's filled with significance, meaning, depth. What's the difference? And the difference, I believe, is whether or not we are really there. It's presence. So if we take a cup of water with our whole being, with our full attention, if we are completely focused on it in the present moment, the sensation of the cup in our hands, the water in our mouth, if we are deeply in touch with that, we become real, the water becomes real, the cup becomes real, that moment becomes real. We are fully present, the water is fully present. That's spiritual. Right? And if we do it, drinking whilst reading something on our telephone or whilst distracted or watching something on a screen, it's kind of shallow, maybe even meaningless. And we kind of miss it. We're a ghost, the water is a ghost, everything's meaningless. So I was living without knowing it in a world of distraction and meaninglessness, and then telling myself everything is meaningless and pointless. And, scientific materialism fitted very nicely into that version of reality, confirming to me that, yes, everything is pointless and meaningless. And spirituality isn't real, because nobody had taught me that it's possible to generate our presence, to bring our presence to bear. And I think I was waiting for some kind of, magical encounter, or a moment, or, communicating with an angel or something. I was waiting for something like that. And what Tai gave me was the possibility to make any moment, any action deep, any moment full of presence, full of spirituality. See, it makes it so concrete, so simple. And we regain our own sovereignty, our ability to, it's not dependent on anybody else. We can do it. It's up to us. Is something possible, but it's something that takes training. So if I think about what is the role of monasticism in our society, and what has it been in the history of Europe, but not only Europe. I mean, I talk about Europe because that's where I grew up. To me, it seems very precious that there were, for a lot of our history, there were people who were fully devoted to this, who gave their whole lives to this. And maybe they didn't call it mindfulness, but I really have a sense that the sounding of the bells in our countryside, the knowledge that there were a group of people who were committed to, these moments of prayer, to prayerfulness, living a life of prayerfulness all day, every day. I believe that just the awareness of that would transform the whole of society. And I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that in the UK, the monasteries were dissolved, the monastics were scattered to the four winds, almost 500 years ago. And what I grew up with is the ruins of these beautiful monasteries. But 500 years ago, nobody was ever more than about half an hour's walk from a monastery. They were really present throughout our land. And maybe not everybody could participate in that way of life, but just knowing that they were part of the body politic, as it were, they were part of our society, I think would change the nature of our society. It would be part of our collective awareness. And I see the possibility for that again now. I really feel like maybe it's necessary. Maybe we need monasteries. I mean, it's a question. You can see for yourself. Is it true? Would it make a difference? Of course, many people these days say, well, we have secular mindfulness. Anybody can be a mindfulness teacher. We don't need, we can separate mindfulness from its religious roots, from its monastic roots. We don't need that. We can, who needs monks and nuns? But I wonder if, even if maybe not all of us have to become monks and nuns, of course we don't, is it not wonderful that there might be some people in our society who are, who we know are doing this full time? And they're part of us, that we're part of each other. There are many things that lay people can do that I can't do, right? Because of my choice. And I'm one of my most pressing concerns, in a sense, is the climate crisis. But I'm not a climate activist. But what I can do as a monastic is support climate activists to do what they do. So they do it for me, and I do this for them. So it's not to say that one is better or more important, but that we need both types of thing. Tai used to say that we, as monastics, we help the helpers. So we don't have a soup kitchen, we don't feed homeless people, we don't go into war zones, we don't engage in climate activism directly, mostly, and not, we're not school teachers, we're not doctors, nurses, care workers, psychotherapists. We don't do any of those things, but we support all of those people to do what they do. And so we interact. So many more things I could say about that. Nick is giving me the time's up sign. So I wanted to talk to you about a few other things, but we can stop there and maybe have a little bit of time for questions, or maybe not time for questions. Maybe Terry can let us know. Maybe it's more important to have time for Dharma sharing. But I encourage you, just as a final thing, to look up Saint Hilda. Saint Hilda was the abbess of a monastery in northeast of England, as it happens. I always think it's Scarborough, but it's not Scarborough. I've forgotten now. Anyway, you can look it up. In the 7th century, so this is long before the dissolution of the monasteries, when the monastic presence was very strong. When I was a first-year novice in Plum Village, I happened to come across this book in the library about Christian saints, and I don't know why I opened it at random, and I found this passage about Saint Hilda, and it has stayed in my heart ever since. And the reason it resonated so much was that, so she was an abbess of a monastery where there were both monks and nuns. Very interesting. So, the power of the patriarchy in monastic practice was not so strong then. It was different. That there could be an abbess of monks and nuns. They lived together. They worshipped together. They prayed together. Lived separately, but all sort of in one place. And when I read about St. Hilda, it reminded me of Plum Village. So when we think about seeds and how long seeds can wait, the patience of the seeds of spirituality, I think they're there. They're waiting to be awoken. And maybe particularly in Britain, we need to reawaken these seeds. We need to bring back at least a few monasteries. Maybe we can start with one in the Plum Village tradition, if you're up for it. And maybe it can be not just a monastery, but a fourfold practice center for people of all walks of life who want to devote their lives to cultivating seeds of spirituality. Yes. So I will stop there, and maybe there are some other threads that can be continued at another time. But thank you for bearing with me this morning. It's a joy to be with you all.
Dear brother, thank you so much. It's been wonderful to invite you into our online Dharma hall. And yes, we'd like part 2, I think. If you had other things to say, then that's it now. You have to come back and say them at some other time. I think questions, it's a little bit late to invite questions now. I think quite a few people join these mornings to have the chance for Dharma sharing. And so I would prefer it if we have a break now. And I know that you can't stay, so you need to get off to another meeting perhaps, or give another talk or something, or have a lazy afternoon. That would be very nice for you, because I know you work very hard. So I'm going to just invite the bell, and then when the bell is finished, we can have a break for about 10 minutes, and then come back for Dharma sharing. If anybody isn't going to stay for Dharma sharing, then please log off so that Katie knows how many rooms to set up. And then I guess if there are people who have a question that's really burning that they need to ask, then do please send to feedback@Plum Village UK, and we'll make sure that somehow, if it's possible to answer it, that we will find an answer for you. So, yeah, many thanks, dear brother. It was lovely to have you here.
Thank you, Terry, and thank you, everyone.